We have a modern tendency to read the Bible privately. We approach the text as isolated individuals, looking for personal application and immediate takeaways. While that devotional reading has value, we are not the first people to open these scriptures. We stand downstream in a centuries-old current of continuous, historic interpretation by the Church. When we detach ourselves from that historical stream, the reading process fractures. Without a collective anchor, our understanding of complex doctrines, especially Christ's saving work, becomes distorted and uneven. The goal of any serious student of Scripture is to move past fragmented readings and construct a structurally sound, systematic theology. We want a framework that holds every biblical theme in correct proportion. That synthesis does not happen by accident. Sound theology is the end product of a rigid, sequential pipeline. You have to feed the raw data through specific layers of analysis before you can trust the output. That pipeline requires three distinct inputs: grammatical, historical exegesis, biblical theology, and historical theology. We follow this framework because each layer provides a specific check on the others. Omitting any of these three inputs shifts the center of gravity, altering the final theological output. Once this structure is in place, we can apply it to the suffering servant narrative of Isaiah 53, a passage whose complexity requires every layer of our pipeline to resolve. The stack begins with grammatical historical exegesis. This is the micro-level work of determining the author's original intent through the text itself. This requires anchoring ourselves in the original Greek and Hebrew. As Martin Luther argued, if we lose our grip on the biblical languages, we will ultimately lose the gospel. Before we can even define a word, exegesis demands we identify the literary genre. You evaluate a historical narrative differently than you evaluate a proverb, a parable, or an epistle. To see exactly why this micro-level precision matters, consider the work of the Australian New Testament scholar Leon Morris on the text of Romans 3. This graphic compares the two rival translations for verse 25. The scholar C.H. Dodd argued the Greek pointed to expiation, meaning Jesus' death simply wiped away human guilt. Morris argued the Greek actually indicates propitiation, meaning Jesus' death actively satisfied divine wrath. By identifying the linguistic necessity of propitiation, Morris helped anchor the Reformation view of the atonement against modern academic shifts. Exegesis gives us precise meaning, but words do not exist in a vacuum. Step 2 of the pipeline zooms out from the micro to the macro, biblical theology. The canon is not a static dictionary of theological terms. It is an unfolding, progressive historical plan tracing from creation and the fall to redemption and the new creation. Within that timeline, God primarily acts through deed revelation. He intervenes in history through massive, physical events like the Exodus out of Egypt or the crucifixion of Christ. But those physical events are not self-interpreting. If an Egyptian saw the Red Sea part, they might conclude Yahweh was a stronger local deity, but they wouldn't automatically understand the theology of salvation. Deeds require word revelation to give them meaning. The prophetic and apostolic words are what define the cross. Without that interpretation, we observe the execution, but miss the atonement. This timeline shows how biblical theology tracks those interpretations across centuries. It connects central themes like covenant, kingdom, and atonement, ensuring that a doctrine studied in Leviticus properly aligns with its fulfillment in the Gospels. Grammatical exegesis mines the raw linguistic data, and biblical theology builds the chronological frame to hold it. The final input is historical theology. But unlike our first two steps, this one does not flow in a clean, straight line from exegesis. If we diagram this pipeline, historical theology drops in on a tangent from the north. It acts as a necessary cross-check, bringing in the accumulated wisdom and the failures of those who mapped the text before us. Relying on history does not violate sola scriptura. That principle means we deliberately and consistently subordinate our tradition to Scripture, not that we ignore the Church's leading thinkers. To see how this protective tangent works, we can analyze the history of how the cross has been understood. Faced with rising liberal theories that reduce Jesus to a moral example, the theologian Emil Brunner published a comprehensive defense re-establishing Christ as a penal substitute who bore our punishment. This matrix shows the theological reaction to Brunner. Shortly after, the scholar Gustav Aulén published Christus Victor, steering away from penal substitution to focus on Christ as the champion who conquered evil powers. Aulén's recovery of the victory motif was significant. He forced the academic world to acknowledge a biblical theme that many had neglected. But he overreached. Aulén tried to force the entire book of Hebrews, and even the writings of Martin Luther, exclusively into the Christus Victor model, despite their obvious reliance on sacrificial substitution. By consulting historical theology, we capture Aulén's recovery of the victory theme, while identifying the blind spots caused by his overreach. History calibrates the pipeline. It stops us from repeating past interpretive errors and prevents us from reducing complex doctrines to a single dimension. Apply the complete three-part methodological stack to the specific sounding of Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12. This is the suffering servant narrative. It is a highly concentrated, structurally complex prophetic block that contains some of the most jarring language in the Old Testament. When we apply our first exegetical step, we immediately encounter a tension between the servant's treatment and his character. This text highlights the sheer brutality inflicted on the servant. His appearance is marred beyond human semblance. He is despised, pierced, crushed, and stricken. The language is soaked in violence and isolation. Yet alongside this abuse, the text establishes the servant's innocence. He is the righteous one. He had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. This creates a severe theological paradox. How can the total, brutal crushing of a sinless, perfect servant be considered just? The text provides a resolution in verse 10. It states, "It was the will of the Lord to crush him." The punishment is just because it is a divine mandate. The mechanism driving this mandate is substitutionary atonement. The servant suffers because the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He is pierced specifically for our transgressions. Having secured the grammar, we run this through the biblical theology layer to see how this localized suffering connects to the canonical timeline. When we look at the structural brackets of the passage, we see that the narrative begins in chapter 52, verse 13, and ends at the close of 53. The violence in the center is wrapped in the language of exaltation. Before the suffering starts, God declares his servant will be high and lifted up, and the passage ends with the servant dividing the spoils of victory. Through the pipeline, a brutal description of an ancient execution transforms. Precise word-level exegesis yields the cosmic canonical truth of a substitutionary, victorious atonement. This is the final output of the pipeline. When exegesis, historical context, and biblical theology are integrated, they construct a systematic theology. The danger in studying salvation is reducing Christ's work to a single dimension. You cannot encapsulate the atonement by solely defining Jesus as a prophet, a priest, or a king. A true systematic theology must account for all the data. It must catalog the 9 distinct saving events, spanning from the incarnation through the resurrection to the final consummation. This array must also hold the 6 primary biblical pictures of the cross. It must integrate penal substitution with reconciliation, purification, and the Christus Victor triumph over the grave. No single theory and no isolated reading is vast enough to capture the entirety of the cross. Only a multi-layered methodology, anchored in language, scoped to the entire canon, and calibrated by history, can bear the weight of Christ's saving work.